Welcome to the Cash or Pass review for Darkest Dungeon 2. This is going to be a special one because I played Darkest Dungeon 1 for about 2,000 hours after it left early access all the way back in 2016, and I played Darkest Dungeon 2 for about 1,200 hours if I want to have a low estimate, starting at day 0 because I got review access. Since then, I've become a staple in the community and a volunteer game tester. I've spoken to the dev team both casually and professionally, getting to know some awesome people in the process. Don't get it twisted either, Red Hook is one of the few developers that want you to candidly say if something is good or sucks. They're adults with thick skin, which is surprisingly rare these days. And trust me, I've been very vocal about what I like and dislike over the last 3 years. All of this to say that I know way too much about the game. Whether it's in-depth mechanics, lore, challenge runs, goofy teams, having to win with goofy teams, I've seen everything this game has to offer many times over. Wayne June returns as the narrator. Fans of the series will recognize his iconic voice from the first game, yet this time he is playing a different character. Instead of your rich uncle ancestor, he is an academic professor and the player is a colleague of his. Together, they research the secrets of the Iron Crown, which leads to the ruin of the known world.
I remember our first meeting on the steps of the university. A collegial handshake. That would doom us both. Your insightful questions during my lectures gave me pause, and I recognized in you something of a kindred spirit. Despite our differences in age and position, we shared a keen fascination for archaeology, folklore, and, of course, occultism.
Mr. June delivers a great performance overall. Those who have played both games feel the Ancestor was a better character than the Academic, and I feel that is because of the writing for each character. In the first game, the Ancestor starts out sounding like your helpful friend. Over time, he starts to sound questionable, and by the end, you realize he's a complete asshole. Besides the story of the Ancestor himself being more interesting, his actual in-game dialogue is more enjoyable because of the subtle viciousness he has, as well as an overwhelming amount of sass. By comparison, the Academic is more of a parental and endearing figure. His dialogue is spoken from a scientific background, which is apparent through the specific words he chooses to say. Since the Academic is a more one-dimensional character, fans tend to like the narrator's performance more in the first game compared to the second. The art style grew up a lot coming from the first game. Instead of 2D bobbleheads with wobbly walking animations, we have fully rendered and animated 3D models. Initially, people thought the models were cel-shaded, but creative director and lead artist Chris Barassa has said the shading is hand-painted. And let's be real too, if there's one thing Chris knows how to use, it's a black brush. To compound the beauty of the art style, the lighting effects in the game are nothing short of stellar. When you combine this with engaging backgrounds and fantastic animations, the game is actually a treat to see in motion. Stuart Chatwood, affectionately called Chadwood by the community, returns for the music as well. The OST in the first game had more stark contrast between regions while being focused on percussion instruments to drive the songs. In 2, the music is still distinct between each region, however, the instrument group of choice is now the string section. Each song makes heavy use of this, and it's almost reminiscent of Elder Scrolls Oblivion, which did a similar thing. The music works, it fits, it's good, it makes sense. For the UI, it gets the job done, but it could be a lot better. Under each combatant are various symbols called tokens, which we'll talk about in the next section. On the left and right sides of the HP bar are buffs and debuffs. These fill in the gaps that tokens leave, such as percentage changes in resist. Finally, on top of the HP bar are your damage over time and healing over time effects. Furthermore, the player has to highlight each of these individually to see what they do. The top and bottom symbols are easy enough to recognize, but the buffs and debuffs on the sides are constantly missed by most players. This issue is made a bit worse with gamepads compared to mouse and keyboard, because the menus are a bit cumbersome when dealing with multiple things. Trying to use the map, check a character sheet, use a store, opening your inventory, all of these have different things popping up, overlapping, and then disappearing. Menus are something I have seen new players complain about before. The in-game tutorials are not amazing, to put it nicely. They're serviceable, but if they were great, then my guides on mechanics wouldn't do as well as they do. The other issue is that they're all crammed into one list together, making it a slog to traverse. If you were wondering where I would have stronger criticism, it's this section. Being a junkie for game mechanics and balance, this is always the part of the game I invest the most effort into learning. The biggest mechanical change between the two games for combat is the token system. Red Hook gave this a test run a few years back with the Shield Breaker DLC in Darkest Dungeon 1. Her Aegis mechanic is the equivalent of a full damage block token. Many of the previous buffs and debuffs have been streamlined into tokens, as well as special mechanics that don't fit as said effects. The simple tokens are the yellow and blue ones, being positive and negative respectively. The teal tokens are special ones, usually character specific. Finally, there are orange tokens, which are primarily for boss mechanics or special attacks. A welcome change that came with tokens was the removal of the base accuracy system. DD1 was notorious for attacks missing or hitting in defiance of the odds to make some crazy clips. While being fun to watch, this presented a problem in the previous game because any hero that wanted to try and hit an enemy during combat would almost exclusively have one trinket slot dedicated to an accuracy item. This is a welcome change in the second game because all accuracy variants is now relegated to dodge and blind tokens, so the player can weigh the risk more easily. The Affinity system is new in the series. Its original reception was not well received because of how aggressive it was and triggering alongside the enormous amount of screen time it ate up. This led to Red Hook reworking it, which took some considerable time. The new version of Affinity is much better, though the debate among players is centered on the question, is the new system good because of merits or because it's simply better than the old system? As it stands now, the new system eats much less screen time and is a bit more flashy but also rare. The other outcome of that is most positive Affinity relationships are simply purchased within items like whiskey. When the game dropped its first trailer, the Affinity system was supposed to be a selling point. Now it's taken a noticeable backseat, but maybe that was for the best. The roster has 2 new heroes to the series, alongside a hefty chunk of the DD1 roster. Plague Doctor, Highwayman, Grave Robber, Men-at-Arms, Hellion, Occultist, Leper, Jester, Vestal, Flagellant, Bounty Hunter all return from the first game. Meanwhile, Runaway and Duelist are new inclusions. The Binding Blade DLC, which gave us Duelist at the end of 2023, also gave us Crusader by fan request. Crusader even comes with a quest to unlock him, which is pretty fun and cool. A new profile for players will start with the base team of Plague Doctor, Highwayman, Grave Robber, and Man-at-Arms. If you purchase the DLC, you get access to Duelist immediately. The rest of the heroes are unlocked through permanent progression, which we will talk about later. During runs, players can find hero shrines. Upon selecting a hero at the shrine, the game either plays a narration or scripted battle sequence, where the player learns more about that hero's backstory. These are a fantastic addition and, in my opinion, one of the highlights of the game. After completing a shrine segment, the hero unlocks a new skill. Unlocking all abilities on all heroes takes quite a while, so it's a nice goal for playing past the end of the game. Paths serve as specializations for characters, oftentimes taking their normal mechanics and changing them up so the character fills a different role in the party. The current roster is in a slow but meticulous process of having their skills and paths reworked to be more modern with the evolution of the game. The game is centered on making teams of 4 and using their tools to overcome challenges, exactly like the first game. Builds are made around what heroes the player has available, what skills and paths they have, as well as which confession they are doing, as some are more favorable to certain heroes than others, like Resentment, which is known for being a somewhat team-restrictive act. With how much paths are changing hero mechanics alongside the aforementioned criteria, there are a lot of different teams that can be put together that play differently even with similar heroes. This is one of the aspects of the game that I enjoy the most. Currently, the game has 5 acts, which are called confessions. Each one of these gives the player a piece of the story with a scaling difficulty and a different final boss. Denial is the first and shortest confession to do, while having the least variety. Resentment is the first, in quotations, full run a player can do, having 3 regions to go through with a choice of all the ones available. By comparison, Denial only gives you 2 choices. The third act, Obsession, is when the game gives the player the full experience. All regions, all enemies are now in the pool for the player to deal with. And speaking with new players, most comment on the jump in difficulty between each of the 3 confessions. The game does a good job of easing you into it before going full throttle. A small aside, there are equipable difficulty modifiers called Infernal Flames, which is an extensive topic that you can learn more about with another video that I made. As of now, we have 4 regions to go through on the trip to the mountain, with a small side area called the Sluice, which randomly appears after Denial. Only 2 regions appear in Denial at all, those being the fiery city called the Sprawl and the undead forest called the Tangle. Starting in Resentment, players can find the Sluice, which as stated was a small side area that's fun and has extra rewards, the Shroud, which is home to Fish Dudes and Fog, and the Foder? The Fetter? The Feeder? I call it the Fetter, but the place where people eat each other. The mountain, home of the final boss, appears in every confession at the end. Each region has a distinct theme. This is great for both variety and player strategy, as different heroes function better in different regions. Each region also has its own unique lair boss. Roads are something worth talking about separately. In the first game, the heroes walk through hallways between rooms, encountering fights and hazards along the way. Roads serve the same function in DD2. They're essentially hallways that the player traverses, with fights and hazards occurring along the way. To me, these are the same thing. People often like to say that hallways were more fun to go through, but those people have clearly never had to backtrack several rooms in the Weald with no walk speed mods, and it shows. They also conveniently ignore the length of Crimson Court maps. The base game starts strong with a good variety of enemies. They are broken up into factions with a couple of elite enemies in each one. Bandits, zombies, and cultists can be found throughout, while each region has a specific enemy set, like fish people and fanatics. These enemies have their own themes and strategies, so it's rarely dull trying to figure out how to beat all of them collectively. As previously stated, each mountain boss per confession is a different one, meaning that the game has 5 different final bosses. This is where I become a massive nerd. The game balance has some issues. Thankfully, as a casual player, you will likely never notice them if you're just playing through the acts a couple of times to see the story. It's when you spend time unlocking everything, running heroes repeatedly, and using the difficulty modifiers that it becomes more apparent. Chief among them are enemy speeds and ordainments. Overall, enemies are pretty fast compared to most heroes. Ordainment is a modifier that becomes more common the further in the run you get, which compounds this issue. Ordination gives enemies bonus HP, damage, and special effects depending on the confession, but it also comes with a hefty +2 to speed. Hero speed does not easily increase over the course of the game. Only a few heroes get a speed bonus from their unlock trees, and speed increasing items are not always available to players, especially at the beginning when several need to be randomly pulled from the gacha machine at the altar that we'll talk about later. Alongside all these factors, with a couple battle modifiers that randomly give enemies speed, it's fairly common to have slower teams watch the 4 enemy attack cutscene at the start of fights. A while back, I made a video discussing the boss design trends of the game. The point that sticks out the most to me is the enemy's ability to hit the entire team, which I call cleaves, and others call AoE. For some reason, the lever that always gets pulled in the majority of boss fights to make them harder is to have the enemy hit the entire team, or at least more than one person at a time. When used sparingly, this is a good mechanic. It puts pressure on resources and decision making. When used constantly, it makes encounters go stale very quickly. The balance between heroes is my final major point for this section. Red Hook is not a large studio, so understandably, they cannot constantly throw bodies at issues to solve them instantly. Unfortunately, this means that hero balance gets squeezed in whenever it can. As of the recording of this video, about half the cast has been tuned up to be modern, while the other half is waiting for its turn. Coupled with the imbalance of the older pass systems, some characters play in a more streamlined and fun fashion than others. This is an issue that will be fixed eventually, so if you're watching this in the year 2069, hopefully it should be done. The Altar of Hope was a later addition during early access. The old progression system worked, but most players found it to be unfun, and so we received the Altar in a later update. To buy upgrades in the Altar, the player needs to bring candles to it. Candles are obtained by numerous elements during a run, such as region goals, hero goals, and completing challenges. Beating the confession also gives a big boost to candles. Maxing the altar probably takes 100 to 200 hours as a loose estimate. Beating all 5 confessions normally takes about half of that time, meaning that players should not stress about completing the altar quickly. If you want some tips and tricks on altar progression, I have a guide that I will link on screen. The system is enjoyable for unlocking because the player picks what they want to get most of the time. The inconsistent place in the altar is called the working fields. In the community, this is affectionately referred to as the gotcha machine for those that are weeb enough to know what that even means. Late game players can reuse this slot machine to pull random gear for the next run, which is a cool feature. In terms of upcoming content, the Confessions game mode is set to get a new region to travel through. We have no details as of the recording of this video. The other update is a new game mode called Kingdoms, and this update will be free at the end of 2024. We also don't know much about this, but from the trailer it looks like a cool addition and seems more akin to a tabletop game. Before we hit a final verdict, there's a couple more things I want to talk about, and the first is the cost of the game. Straight up, the base game costs too much. $40 is a big ask for an indie title. It's expecting the first game to pull a lot of weight to make you interested in the second. I do not know this for certain, but from my outside perspective, it seems that the game's base cost will be high. However, the game does receive periodic free content updates, and in the case of Kingdoms, a new free game mode. When you look at it that way, $40 is a bit easier to digest. The one DLC the game has so far, The Binding Blade, gives 2 heroes with full storylines and 1 quest chain for $10 USD. 2 heroes for $10 is really good considering how much work goes into them, so this further offsets the sticker shock of the base game. On Steam, the game goes on sale for all the major seasonal sales. There's also a bundle that discounts Darkest Dungeon 2 if you already own Darkest Dungeon 1, though this bundle isn't permanent at the moment. I cannot speak for consoles, yet I hope the sales on those stores are also generous. For you console players specifically, there's a combo pack of the base game with the first DLC, which I would recommend grabbing if you are totally set on buying this. You get Duelist, who is a brand new character to the series, as well as being the hardest to play in this game, and you get Crusader, who is a fan favorite that is incredibly flexible for most team comps. For new players to the series, if you missed the hype train for Darkest Dungeon 1 and you want to jump into the series, this is the best spot to do it. This game is more straightforward than the previous, and in many cases, it's also easier to understand. For you Darkest Dungeon veterans, if you're not a purist that refuses to ever touch the game, because apparently Darkest Dungeon 1's a perfect creature, you can actually have a lot of fun, especially if you enjoyed the first game. The combat is similar while being different enough, and a lot of the previous heroes make it back in. The new heroes are fun to play, and the game itself looks gorgeous. The big question, cash or pass? I would, at this point, say cash. I have seen plenty of people play this game through the first 5 confessions and don't sink 500 hours into it, and they think it's great. A lot of the issues I previously mentioned start coming up when you're a massive turbo nerd and you just play the game religiously like it's your job. The game is easy enough to pick up and put down. You just spend 30 minutes to maybe an hour, you run through one region, get to the end, that's your checkpoint, and then you can just stop there. The game also saves anytime you leave it, so really you can just drop it whenever. Despite my heavy critiques at times, I do love this game. There's a saying that we're harshest on the things we love most, or something like that. Is it true? Who cares? If you do end up buying it, let me know what you think. Don't forget, I have a lot of content showcasing the game and breaking it down. If you want to join the community, there are links for Discord and Twitch, as well as Patreon if you want to support the channel in the box below. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.